All right, so last time we took a look at another stage of making the plausibility argument regarding relevance realization. And I'd already shown you how everything converged on relevance not everything, how a lot of things, that's really too over the top. How a lot of issues in cognitive science converge on relevance realization as a central problem. It can, right? You can see it in psychology, you can see it in linguistics, etc. We talked about a lot of those issues, and then I started to show you how you could give a naturalistic account, how you could analyze, formalize, and potentially mechanize relevance realization. Along the way, I was beginning to show you the second half of the plausibility argument, the multi-aptness of the relevance realization construct, particularly for explaining things that are central to the course, the kind of meaning we're talking about in this course, self-transcendence, wisdom, spirituality, those kinds of issues, such that we could talk about having a cognitive science of human spirituality in a way which would afford us a deep response to the meaning crisis. Now, of course, we still have to do that second half, but I was trying to show you some of that already. That became more apparent as we did the naturalized movement on relevance realization. We took a look at the fact that relevance realization can't be found at the level of representation. It can't be found at the level of computation. It can't be found in any sort of one centralized executive, so to speak. Many of you know I'm critical of that idea. Instead, it has to be self-organizing, scale invariant. It has to be sub-representational, sub-computational. And I propose to you that the bioeconomics of the brain in the body are the level we're talking about, because economies are self-organizing, scale invariant processes. And they give us different kinds of norms, not logical norms, not sort of truth content norms, but logistical norms, norms of efficiency and resiliency, for example. Then we talked about what might seem to be a potential glitch in this project, namely the fact that you can't have a scientific theory of relevance. Relevance isn't something to be detected because scientific theories require systematic import. They require categories that are stable, homogeneous, and made up of intrinsic properties. This is a core idea going back to J.S. Mill. And relevance lacks all of those properties. The events and things that we find relevant are not stable. Obviously, relevance is not an intrinsic property, and the class is not homogeneous in any fashion. But that turns out to actually be an important impasse, because the insight for overcoming it puts us on, I think, a good pathway to giving a naturalistic account of relevance realization. Namely, what I just said, we don't need a theory. In fact, we can't have a theory of relevance. Relevance is a constantly evolving phenomena. And that was actually the move that I made. I suggested to you that we could draw an increasingly strong analogy between Darwin's theory of evolution and his theory of fittedness, and the idea that relevance realization is a way in which a brain at a cognitive level is constantly evolving its informational and problem-solving fittedness to its environment, and that's actually what we mean by intelligence. In order to do that, we talked about what kind of theory Darwin's theory was. It was a dynamical systems theory about how fittedness was constantly being re-realized, how it was constantly evolving in terms of a changing context. And what we did was look at, following some of the seminal work of Alicia Guerrero, what it is to give a dynamical systems theory. And in order to do that, we confronted the old way of giving scientific theories, or at least what we thought was the old way, the Newtonian way as explained by Kant. And as we talked about it, Kant had a problem with living things, because living things demonstrate circular causation, feedback cycles, and for Kant, if you had circular causation, you would end up in circular explanation, and that, of course, is a vacuous form of explanation and cannot serve as the basis for science. What Guerrero points out is that there's a distinction between causes and constraints. Causes are events that make things happen, whereas constraints are conditions that make things possible. And we can talk about two types of constraints. We can talk about selective constraints that narrow the options, enabling constraints that open up the options. And with the distinction between cause and constraints and between two types of constraints, we can trace out the circular pathway without falling into circular explanation. And we went back to the tree and talked about how that worked. We then looked at that Darwin's theory was, in fact, such a theory. We made use of a metaphor from Urero. The selective constraints can be thought of as a virtual governor. Then we extended the metaphor with the enabling constraints being virtual generators and the systematic relationship between them being a virtual engine. And what Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is he discovers the virtual engine that regulates the circular process of sexual reproduction. So you have scarcity acting as a selective constraint, reducing the options on design. You have variation as an enabling constraint, increasing the options on design, and the systematic relationship between them causes the design of the organism, its morphological design, to constantly be altered and changed in a manner that is, fitted to how the environment is constantly changing, etc. And of that, of course, is the theory of evolution. And then I proposed to you that what we could do, I'm going fairly rapidly because this is review. Is that okay? Please put up your hand if you want anything clarified. And then what I propose to you is that we could look for exactly that kind of thing. We could look for a virtual engine in the brain that is regulating its feedback, informational feedback relationship with the environment. Many of you have noted that this is already to move towards an embodied idea about cognition, and we will come back to that today and later on in the course. And the idea is the brain is constantly trading between two opponent goals, two logistical norms that regulate its bioeconomy. The brain is trying to become more efficient, to use as few resources as it can, And that means it tends to compress data together in order to generalize it and make itself a general purpose machine that will pick up on cross-contextual invariance. And that picks up on when what's invariant is what is most important or relevant. But the brain has an opponent process, of being resilient so that it can repair itself, it can redesign itself, it can have options open to it in the future, And in that way, the brain becomes, does information particularization. It tends to specialize its processing and create a whole bunch of special purpose machines that give it, contextual sensitivity and a lot of variation in its design. And the brain is constantly moving between compression, which integrates, and particularization, which differentiates. And as it integrates and differentiates in a parallel manner, it is complexifying. It is, creating new functions. It is going through qualitative change in the kind of machine it is. It's a machine of machines that can make itself into a new kind of machine in the way it is interacting with its environment. And I propose to you that that is the core sort of formal theory of what relevance realization is. I then propose to you that that relevance realization, those processes could potentially be seen operating in the brain in self-organizing criticality, in which the brain oscillates between states in a scale-invariant manner, which is important because that was one of the things we needed for a good theory of relevance realization. In a scale-invariant manner, you see self-organizing criticality in the brain. You see neurons firing in synchrony, which seems to map very carefully onto data compression. And then you see them avalanching and particularizing and differentiating. And that seems to, as I said, be mapping onto resiliency. And what we saw is the brain is constantly oscillating between these. And if relevance realization is the core of our intelligence, as I argued 2 classes ago, it plausibly is, then we should see a very good relationship between measures of general intelligence, psychometric measures of general intelligence, and measures of self-organizing criticality in the brain. And that, in fact, has been found. That has been found directly with Thatcher's work in 2008, and a good follow-up argument about variability and integration in the brain at Zhang et al. In 2016. We then took a look at not only how relevance realization is potentially implemented in how neurons fire, but also in how neurons wire together, how they create long-term structures and networks. In order to do that, we made use of network theory. We took a look at 3 kinds of networks. A random network, which is very efficient but low in resiliency. A regular network, which is very high in resiliency and low in efficiency. And a small world network that has the optimal relationship between efficiency and resiliency. It would be the kind of network the brain would produce if it was trying to optimize the relationship between efficiency and resiliency. And so, if that's the case, then we should expect that small world networks should be correlated with measures of intelligence, if intelligence is relevance realization. And in fact, Langer et al. Found that the more the brain is wiring up as a small world network, the more intelligent it is. We noted that these 2 ideas, these 2 theoretical entities, self-organizing criticality and small world network, mutually reinforce each other. If you fire in a SOC fashion, self-organizing criticality, you will tend to wire as a small world network and vice versa. So that can bootstrap itself. There's a dynamic relationship there for bootstrapping how the brain is evolving its fittedness to its environment. So not only in addition to some of the references I gave Thatcher and Langer and Zhang et al., I pointed out how some of these ideas have been taken up back into some of the core issues we talked about, how you could see insight, for example, how some theorists are arguing that insight is a moment of self-organizing criticality that transforms a regular network into a small world network. So that shows you the plausibility and the power of this way of thinking about relevance realization. Along the way, I pointed out that this has, and if you can come up with a better adjective, I would like it, but this has spiritual significance. It's impoverished, right? Existential isn't quite right, right? And spiritual sounds like Harry Potter or something. But what I meant by that is it has important implications for sapiential pursuits of self-transcendence and wisdom and understanding. Older ideas, perhaps in new lights, older ideas of faith, right, as involvement and connectedness, religio. Because I pointed out that relevance realization is not cold calculation. It is endemic. It is the way in which your brain is evolving itself and involving itself. It is the way in which your brain is making, right, ongoing complex patterns of decisions about what is salient and what is important. Risky decisions about how to commit its time and its resources, right? Relevance involves what grabs your attention, what arouses your affect and your motivation, right? Relevance realization, as we'll see, is a fundamental felt kind of connectedness in which you are involved and caring about how you are processing information. And as I mentioned, the neuroscientist Reid Montague has argued that's the fundamental difference between us and computers. Computers do not care about the information they're processing. We do, and we have to. And the reason he gives is precisely a bioeconomic reason. Computers have virtually unlimited energy and time. That's why they can run hot and fast. They can commit all their resources to any problem. You can't, ever. Your brain runs slow and warm, right? Because your brain is constantly caring about some information rather than others, because it has to take care of itself. It has to manage its bioeconomy because it has limited time and resources. Relevance realization is this fundamental connectedness. It is pre-egoic. It is pre-rational. It is pre-empirical, right? It's pre-normative. It is deeply about your fundamental framing of reality, a fundamental framing out of which your sense of self and your sense of a meaningfully structured world co-arise. As I'm going to argue later, this means that relevance realization is not subjective in nature, because it precedes and affords your subjectivity. Neither is it objective in nature, because relevance is not an objective property of the environment. Relevance realization is a fundamental relatedness between you and your world, like evolution, like fittedness. Fittedness is not a property of the organism or the environment, but a real relation between them. So in that sense, as I'm going to argue, relevance realization is not subjective or objective, it is transjective. It is thrown between, not thrown. Subjective means thrown under. That's subjectivity. Objective means thrown against. Relevance realization is transjective. It is inherently between you and the world. It's something that the brain and the environment co-create together. And this is the central idea of embodied cognitive science, that you look for how cognition works by looking at and focusing on the relation between the brain and the environment in order to find cognition. Yes?
Did you come up with the word transjective?
Yes.
Blowing my mind.
Yes, I did. I also thought I came up with the word complexification, but people started using it about 2 or 3 years ago, so I don't know.
Oh, complexification in the sense of
The-
differentiating and integrating.
Yeah. So I believe that's where we got to. Is that correct? Because what I want to do now, I'll take your clarification question in a second, comment. What I want to do now is, that was the hardest lecture of the course, last class. Okay? That was the hardest one. That was the most nitty-gritty, because what I wanted to do was make it very plausible to you that this could be a nuts and bolts science. Because I'm going to now take that for granted as I go on in the course. So what I want to concentrate now is on the experiential, the phenomenological, the sapiential, and the spiritual aspects of relevance realization, and the way this can give us a multi-apt way of understanding meaning, wisdom, self-transcendence, and potentially, right, 2 important things. One, can it help us understand the psychotechnologies we're going to need in order to bring back the wisdom projects, address the meaning crisis? And secondly, can it help us to address, right, those aspects of the meaning crisis given to us by, right, our Western tradition, sapiential obsolescence, the restless narcissistic self, and most importantly, the loss of the 3 orders of meaning. So very ambitious. So Thomas. Very loudly, Thomas.
I was just wondering what the
Zhang et al?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where would I find that?
It's an advanced release, I believe, of Brain. If you come up during the break, I can show you the article on my computer. Okay? All right. So I'm going to take it that I have shown you the convergence to RR and the naturalization of RR. I've started to show you the promise of this, but that's what the rest of the course is going to be about, this half of the plausibility argument. But that is why I spent so much time doing 2 things: laying out the problem or the issue, which is the meaning crisis, and then doing the convergence, doing the naturalization. Because if I don't do that, some of the claims I'm going to make are going to be tremendously pretentious. Like, imagine someone, saying to you that, they have a science of human spirituality, and they're not Tom Cruise or something like that, right? They're actually trying to be serious, which I believe I'm trying to be serious. That goes against about, 2.5, 3 centuries where we have, rigidly seen these as, in opposition to each other. And it's still a prevalent part of the way the United States of America is currently understanding itself. Right? And secondly, I want to try and, broach something that is on the borders of being hubristic. I want to talk about a potential science of enlightenment. What is it to be enlightened? I'm not the only person trying to do this right now, by the way. Andrew Newberg has released a book on trying to get at the neuroscience of enlightenment. All right, so what I want to do now is show you some of the phenomenological aspects of relevance realization. Whereas phenomenology is to study, it's the discipline study of the structures of experience. We've already looked at underlying processing. How does that structure our experience? And again, what is the sapiential and spiritual and existential import of that structuring? Well, the first thing we should note, right, is that relevance realization gives us a series of landscapes. Now, I mentioned one already in the class that I took, a name I've taken from Ramachandran, and it was advanced in order to explain what's going on in autism. I'll explain to you that in a sec. But I'm going to try and extend Ramachandran's idea of a salience landscape by integrating it with the earlier work that Matson did in 1976 in his book Sentience. Okay, first let's go over what Ramachandran meant by this. So a salience is how things stand out to you, how they grab your attention, what you're focusing your actions and efforts upon. What he was arguing was that for autistic individuals, the salience landscape is very different than that for statistically normal people, and that can actually help to explain a lot of their behavior, because too many things are salient in the wrong way, according to Ramachandra, and a lot of autistic behavior, again according to him, can be understood as attempts to ameliorate the fact that the salience landscape is statistically abnormal. It's getting those individuals to over-focus on some things and under-focus on other things in order to successfully frame and solve the problems they need to frame and solve in order to work successfully in our culture and environment. Similar kinds of moves, something very similar to a salience landscape is also now being invoked by people studying schizophrenia, especially Kapoor, and also some related work by Oss. So the idea is that what's happening in schizophrenia is the irregular production of dopamine. Dopamine is not joy juice in your brain, by the way. That's another oversimplification by the media. Dopamine really isn't so much about reward as it's about predicting what's important, right? And so what happens is when you get the aberrant dopamine production in the schizophrenic's brain, you get an aberrant salience landscape, right? Too many things and too many connections are salient. And so what the schizophrenic often does is generate a theory to try and account for the aberrant salience landscape. Finally, there's similar ideas in learning theory, Rumbaugh and others, about the salience-based theory of learning, that even things like classical conditioning are being filtered through the salience landscape of an organism. What stands out for it, what matters to it. So, again, a lot of converging evidence that this is now becoming a prominent idea in understanding the nature of cognition. So you're experiencing a salience landscape right now, and it's constantly shifting. So it's much more like a seascape than a landscape, if I were to stretch the metaphor, in that it's constantly shifting and moving around. So presumably, I'm very salient, and my voice and my face are the most salient aspects. So if you were to draw sort of a topography, you know, there's me and there's my face, and then there's other things, right? Other parts of the environment that aren't quite as salient but stand out for you. And your salience landscape is constantly shifting. What's going on in the salience landscape? Can we get a little bit more? I think we can if we make use of the work of Matson. And then Vervaeke et al. And a couple of unpublished manuscripts, because we're working on this in connection with the theory of consciousness that's only been presented at a conference and things like that. But the idea here is we took Matson's idea and we gave it sort of a dynamic systems approach. I'm not going to go into the argument now. I don't think that's in any way trespassing on his text. He's trying to do that in 76, but he doesn't have the theory or the math to do it. What you can see is that relevance realization is happening at multiple levels in an interactive top-down, bottom-up fashion. So just to remind you, we did this before, right? That you're finding the word level relevant in order to disambiguate the features, but the features, you have to find them relevant in the right way in order to build up the word. You guys remember this, yes? And the answer is that it's happening in a dynamic, self-organizing fashion. Now what you see there is a process that Matson actually broke out, analyzed. So at the lowest level, there's what Vervaeke et al. Call in our explanation of Matson. Is everybody else hearing that? Okay, good. Because that could be like the sign of a seizure about to onset. That's it for John. We never will know how this all turns out. Okay, so featurization is the fact, right, that you're picking certain features out of the world as relevant. You're making them stand out, you're giving them attentional focus, etc. And then that feeds into foregrounding and feeds back from foregrounding. Foregrounding is some of the features are put into the foreground and some of them are put into the background. Obviously not like chunk, chunk, it's a continuum. That's why the notion of a landscape is being used. Right? The foregrounding feeds into figuration, which also feeds back down to this level. This is what is foregrounded is figured into something. You know, like when you figure out what something is, you figure out this is a bottle. So a bunch of features, right? And then it gets foregrounded, and then it gets, right, figured as a bottle. Right? And then, right, there's framing. This is where you are formulating, finding, and formatting problems. So there's problems I might, right? So this is, right, stood out to me, the features, it gets foregrounded, it gets configured as a bottle, and then I frame it in a certain way so that some of my goals can be resolved through interacting with it in a particular way. And so my framing of the bottle will change depending on how, right, I'm appropriating it for what problems. So if I want to, of course, consume a liquid, I'm framing it as a container, whereas if Thomas suddenly loses it, I will reconfigure, I will reframe this as a potential weapon that I could, this is actually quite deadly, by the way. Right? It's a good weapon to have if you want to beat somebody up and not leave any record on them for the cops. Probably shouldn't have said that on a video, but there you go. So why I said that is I'm showing you a way in which you can frame this that might not initially occur to you, but in other contexts, right, you would reframe it. Yes?
I have two questions. The first one I'll talk about that, which is, does Matson talk about going the other way around? Like, let's say you're in a search for a container. So now features that look like containers are going to be more...
are going to stand out for you.
So does he talk about the other
Yep.
way?
That's why we thought it was completely legitimate to make it self-organizing like this.
Yeah. Foregrounding. Oh, I see. The second question is, would you say cameras do the first three steps? Where, like, it'll be pixels, and then sometimes it'll adjust, it'll foreground, and then it'll be like crystal clear in front. Like, would that be equivalent? Like,
They're starting to do some of this to the degree to which we build some AI into our... I mean, a camera, just as a camera, doesn't do that. But we can build in some AI that does this. Actually getting them to do this in a way that would allow an autonomous robot to move around has turned out to be a very, very hard problem. Because this is not sort of a philosophically intractable problem, but this just turns out to be a really, really complex process. So Matson has a name for this. He calls it sizing up. Sizing up of situations.
So none of that requires some sort of experience, like it's just
No, I mean, I think you have to do this.
for self-awareness or anything.
No, and I think you have to do this. I mean, that's what I mentioned when I talked about the salience-based theory of learning. You have to be doing this, right, in order to learn from your environment. Now, of course, your learning is going to feed into all of these and start to modify. And we've talked about that from the beginning. We've talked about the fact that although relevant, that's why I use the word pre, right? Relevance realization is pre-representations, but the representations then can dramatically feed back and impact because it's this continual self-organizing process. The point I'm making is this is recursive relevance realization. This is relevance realization feeding into relevance realization that feeds back into relevance realization, that feeds up into relevance realization. This is relevance realization within relevance realization within relevance realization. This is nested, recursive, dynamically self-organizing complexification of relevance realization. And it's going like this. Okay? That is going to produce this complex, textured, right, landscape of what you're experiencing as initially relevant to you. What will initially grab your attention. What will initially be the basis for your learning. So sizing up and this recursive, right, complexifying relevance realization is going to produce a salience landscape. I happen to think, and there's reason to believe, as I mentioned, many people are arguing that theory of consciousness is going to be grounded in a theory of relevance realization. I pointed that out to you. I didn't go into it in detail, but I mentioned that. I think this idea of the salience landscape is a significant part of what, it's not identical to or exhaustive of, but I think it is a significant part of what we mean when we say that something is conscious. It's the ability to, right, participate in this kind of flowing salience landscape. Why am I saying that? Because the reverse, given our discussion, is going to be the case. Using attention to alter consciousness will, of course, alter the machinery of sizing up and how you're generating your salience landscape. It is plausible that one of the ways in which mindfulness ameliorates anxiety and depression is precisely because it helps to alter the salience landscapes that are associated with anxiety and depression. Okay, so you have a salience landscape, this textured, right? It's not even a thing, it's just this textured field. See, this is where meaning is not some abstract concept. It's the way in which, right, the environment and the relevance realization machinery of your brain are making this, textured pattern of how you pay attention. Very complex, textured pattern that is constantly evolving and redesigning itself. But of course, once we get to here, that launches us into something else. We're going to interact with objects, right? And that coupling between the brain and the environment creates a particular kind of relationship, a kind of relationship that is becoming central to third-generation cog-sci, the form of cognitive science that emphasizes the relatedness, the dynamic relatedness between the brain and the environment as the central place for understanding cognition. This relationship, what is co-created initially, right? Well, this is co-created between the brain and the environment, but what that then leads to is the co-creation of the basic kind of relation of interaction, okay? So, one of the core notions in third-generation cognitive science is the notion of an affordance. It goes back to the psychologist William Gibson, but there's lots of people doing work on the notion of an affordance. Okay? So, an example of an affordance is that this bottle is graspable to me. Okay? It's graspable. Now, being graspable is not just a property of the bottle. It's not just a property of my hand. It's a property of the relationship between the properties of the bottle and the properties of my hand. Right? The bottle affords, in relationship to my hand, grasping. And the idea is, what an affordance is, right, is the basic way in which an organism is making sense of its environment. This is Gibson's, it was called the ecological approach to visual perception. I studied and co-authored papers with one of Gibson's greatest disciples, John Kennedy. I learned a lot from John, and I'm very grateful for what he taught me. And then, as I said, this has been taken up as a central notion within embodied cognitive science. Affordances are relative to the organism. So this is perchable for a bird. I do not experience it that way. That would be very odd or strange. Okay? Obviously, affordances change as you go through both cognitive and biological development, right? So the way the world, a way in which there's affordances for you when you're a small child is different than the kind of affordances you have when you're an adult. So Linda Smith was here at the UTism, and she showed sort of some video stuff of what the world looks like to you if you're like a toddler, because your proportions are very different. Your head is much bigger, your body is much smaller, your center of gravity is different, your visual plane is different, and your arms reach out and fill your vision much differently than you do with an adult. So the way the world discloses itself, that the kinds of affordances that are generated are very different, which helps to explain why children, right, interact with the world the way they do, right? So they have a lot of, right, affordances that are sort of very fixed for how they can interact, especially with their mouth with things. I bet that that's gone down for you. I bet you're not experiencing a lot of the environment in terms of, can I put that in my mouth? You might, to some degree, for some things, but, right, you've probably changed, right, developed out of that. Now, this notion of an affordance means that there's a way in which, right, things present themselves to us. Like, this is a nexus of affordances for me. A bunch of affordances intersect in this object. And what happens is, right, you have to think of an affordance as a bidirectional thing, right? Because, for example, when I'm grasping the bottle, right, I'm not only relating to the bottle, I'm relating to my own hand, right, and my hand is shaping itself to the bottle, right? It's a way in which, and this is the language I want to use, it's a way in which this object, whatever it is presenting itself to me, and the way that I am presenting myself to it. Right? So what's happening is I'm sort of assigning it, right, a certain set of properties, and I'm assuming a certain set of orientations, and they co-create each other. They interact and fit to each other in this dynamic fashion. So that all of the affordances of this, right, means it presents itself to me as a bunch of interactions I can have with it. But the reverse is also the case. My brain's sort of calculating, this isn't quite the right word, maybe evolving, all my potential interactions with it, picks out, right, how it's going to present itself to me. The two are the same, two sides of the same coin. So what you actually have, this affordance generation actually gives you what I call a presence landscape. How right? Where presence is supposed to capture the relationship between you and some aspect of the world. It's how the world is presenting itself to you for interaction and how you are presenting yourself to the world for interaction. So, another way of thinking about this, and we're going to come back to this later at a higher level, affordances reflect an agent-arena relationship. An arena is a place, right, that is structured for interaction. And an agent is a being, right, that can structure itself to be an actor and not just a behavior. Remember when we talked about that when we talked about the robot? The robot has to be able to, right, pick out the consequences of its actions and alter it in order to be an agent. Right? So affordances are, right, when what's happening is the relevance realization machinery is fitting you to the world, so the world is turning into an arena, and it's fitting you to the world so that you're an agent within that arena. And those are both mutually and reciprocally interdefining. That's why if you're suddenly taken out of a standard set of arenas for you, you will experience what's called culture shock. You will lose your sense of agency because you're in, right? Things are not presenting themselves to you as they normally do, and you therefore lose your sense of agency. And some of you are probably foreseeing how that might be relevant to a meaning crisis, losing your sense of agency. Okay, so the presence landscape is exactly that. It's this relationship of affordance that is emerging out of, right, the relevance realization fittedness of the agent to the arena. So you've got the salience landscape, and then within it you start the process of interaction, and then the interaction starts to unfold the world as, right, an arena, and starts to shape you as an agent. And so now you have a presence landscape. You now have a presence landscape. So not only are you orienting your attention, you're starting to assume your agency. Is that okay so far? This is the phenomenology. This is when we're getting into like the structuring of your experience. But all of these processes that I keep talking about, these coupling and evolving, these are all versions of this recursive, dynamically self-organizing relevance realization. That's inherently developmental, inherently complexifying, inherently creating new functionality for your brain to constantly fit itself in new ways to a constantly complex and changing environment. Okay, salience landscape, presence landscape. But now when you're interacting with the world, this brings you into a third thing that matters to you, right? Because typically, you're not just pursuing goals right here, right now. As your cognitive scope expands, remember Plato with the man versus the monster, as you are pursuing more long-term goals, right, you have to start making distinctions between the kinds of patterning that you're interacting with. And you're saying, what are you talking about? Okay. Patterns, right, are the primary way in which you are, right, doing this. You're finding patterns, you're finding patterns. We'll talk a little bit more about that, because basically what a pattern is about how you're finding pieces in the environment co-relevant to each other, relevant to you, and how you can use those patterns to make yourself relevant to others. So we're going to come back to that. So that's just a foreshadow. Let's go back to this notion, these patterns. The biggest issue you face, which is another relevance realization issue, is there's, right, two kinds of patterns. And you want to zero in on one and not be misled by another. You want to find causal patterns and not get attached to correlational patterns. One of the main jobs of the experimental method, as we've already said, is to deal with bias. One of the most important biases that you have to deal with is that we tend to confuse correlation with causation. Many variables are correlated, they have a patterned relation, but it doesn't reflect anything actually going on in a causal way in the environment. So, let me give you a couple of examples of this. There's a correlation, a very good correlation, by the way, between how big your wedding is, right, and how long your marriage will last. Okay? Now, there's no causal relation such that I'll make my wedding bigger as a way of causing my marriage to last longer. The correlation, hey, well, let me ask you, what do you think the correlation actually reflects? What are the underlying causal factors? Yes?
I'm wondering if it could reflect the fact that you have a lot of social...
Right. So lots of social support, which actually can be causative in helping you deal with the emotional stress and strains of trying to keep a marriage together. Okay, and I've been in it, and it's a demanding task. Okay, what else? Yeah. Enough, big wedding. Right? Money solves a lot of stress. Okay, so having enough financial resources or economic network also, yes.
It's really a stereotype, but like I'm Italian, so I'm thinking like Italians, like there's a patriarchal sort of like cultural norm that you don't get divorced. I'm thinking like a big wedding might be associated with certain cultural norms.
Right. So the big wedding might trigger a lot of enculturation machinery. Is that fair enough, Rachel? That helps keep you sort of self-regulated in the marriage. Exactly. There you go. Those are the causal factors. And you actually want to zero, so let's say your goal is a long-term and satisfying marriage, because long-term and unsatisfying shouldn't be anybody's goal, all right? Okay? Like you don't want to zero in on the big wedding. You want to ultimately zero in on the factors that are predictive of a long-term marriage. For example, when you're selecting a potential partner. Right? I know it sounds crass and unromantic, isn't it? Isn't it horrible of John to be so critical of all this romantic? No, John doesn't think it's horrible. I think we should do everything we can to get rid of romantic ideology surrounding our relationships. I mean, part of what we're doing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, with that romantic ideology, I think I've mentioned this before, is we're trying to fit all of the three orders that we've lost, all of that meaning that used to be born by God and history, into our romantic relationships and make this one person bear it all for us. You will take the place of God and history and tradition and the ascent of self-transcendence and the cultivation of wisdom and deep. You will do this for me now. We shouldn't do that to each other. So pay attention, beyond all the romantic BS, the kinds of factors that are actually causally predictive of a stable and satisfying long-term relationship. So you want to track that. You want to find that. Here's another one. Okay? So I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian family, extended family too, which means I spent a lot of my life as I was growing up feeling like I did not belong. And this actually helps to explain something. A colleague of mine, we wrote several papers together. He said people go into psychology to study what they most lack in their lives. So I'm studying relevance. Because as I grew up, I didn't feel like I belonged. That just wasn't the case. Because things like this would happen. There'd be a discussion about, there'd be a discussion about things like, things have gotten so much worse since we took prayer out of the schools. If we brought prayer back, things would get better. Crime has gone up. First of all, it's just false. Crime hasn't gone up. Crime has been steadily going down because crime is a demographic factor, and crime was basically due to the bulge created by the baby boomers. And as they age, crime goes down. Okay? Right. So it's a false claim, which seems to have no impact on the political discourse in the United States of America. Things being false don't seem to matter. Right? But let's say it was true. Let's say it was true. Does that mean there's a causal relationship? Well, here's another one. another similar sort of crisis. Do you know that as Caribbean piracy has gone down, greenhouse gas emissions have gone up? It's true. So you know how we can deal with global warming? Let's bring back Caribbean piracy. What we need is a lot of wooden ships and a lot of people dressed like pirates sailing in the Caribbean, attacking shipping. That'll end. Of course, it's ridiculous. The reason why Caribbean piracy goes down is because of industrialization, and industrialization made the wooden ships and the sailing vessels of Caribbean piracy obsolete, the enhanced communication, the greater force and power that nation states could put on the seas because of industrialization. That's what ended Caribbean piracy. Okay, so you need to zero in on the causal factors rather than the correlational factors. This is one of the primary things that the psychotechnology of the experimental method does for us, because that's a very hard thing to do. Now your brain, it looks like, is doing something sort of implicitly like that. It's trying to make predictions and trying to interact with the world, and it's trying to figure out what are the causal patterns as opposed to the correlational patterns. Now, I think there's a good way of thinking about this. One way in which we deal with, we still have the distinction between illusion and reality, or at least between appearance and reality, is that correlations are mere appearance, whereas causation is real. I'm not saying that's all of the distinction, but what I'm saying is at the level of our phenomenology, this is an important interactional and embodied way in which it plays out. So we tend to use the metaphor of depth for real, right? So appearances are superficial or on the surface, whereas the reality is deeper, right? And what I'm suggesting to you is that you have machinery for getting a depth landscape. You come wired for that. So there's some evidence going back to Machot and others that very, very young children, like months old, can start to distinguish causal patterns from correlational patterns. Okay. So this is also, right, happening right now. This is also part of what your relevance realization machinery is zeroing in on. It's trying to zero in on, right, causal relevance. Yes, Thomas?
I was just, when we talking about the landscape part, are we actually talking about the actual metaphor itself? So we're talking about in terms of trying to get causal patterns, like, for example, when we talk about the logical site, just the patterns of how lights reflecting off the table or whatever suggests the actual depth of the table of the primary perspective.
Oh,
Are we talking more conceptually?
yeah, I'm talking about like ontological depth. Ontological depth. Although, I mean, real depth is also something you want to pick up on.
I just meant to talk about affordances and the logical site.
Yeah. So, these landscapes, of course, although we can analyze them this way, and they have sort of this progression, right? This presupposes this. Because if you can't interact with things, you're not going to be able to distinguish causation from correlation. And then this presupposes your salience landscape. Because if you don't have things picked out, if you don't size up situations, you're not going to realize affordances for interaction. But, although we can analyze them this way and talk about their relative dependence relations, you don't experience them separately. You experience them as deeply interpenetrating with each other. And if you remember, right, we had an important thinker who, right, was cautioning us against, right, this pulling apart from this. That was Socrates. Remember? And we picked up on the idea of Frankfurt. When your salience machinery becomes uncoupled from you trying to figure out, right, what's really going on, then, of course, you're doing the kind of thing that Socrates and Plato most worried about. You're starting to get into the form of cognition that is deeply self-deceptive and self-destructive. Plato argued that, in fact, you have an opposite drive, a counter-bullshit drive. He wouldn't have put it that way, right? But the idea is you have a drive to get at what is real. You don't want things just to be... Remember the example of the person that went home, right? All the salience landscape wasn't going to be changed. The affordance landscape wasn't going to be changed. She just was told that none of it was what? Remember? Real. Her parents didn't really love her, right? Love was not causing their behavior. All the interactional patterns would stay the same, and the way things stood out and were salient and marked would stay the same, but the depth would be lost. Okay? So putting all that together, what I'm arguing is that what you're actually seeking is for salience to track presence in depth. When this is working properly, when this machinery is working properly, your salience landscape is tracking so that you can, right, get into the affordance landscape, the presence landscape, which ultimately enables you to figure out what are the causal structures as opposed to the merely correlational structures. So you want salience to track presence in depth. And I think we should have a name for that, and that landscape in which salience is tracking presence in depth, and it's kind of the opposite of bullshit. So I'm going to call that, right, the significance landscape. The significance landscape. Because your salience machinery is helping you to, right, track things in a way that's going to be significant to you. Where significant means, right, the opposite of bullshit. That your salience machinery is helping you track how to interact with things in a real way. Which, of course, right, is a primary goal that you have. It's interesting how important that drive is. We talked about this before, but I'll remind you about it. And now that I've taught you some of the axial stuff, and you've seen how much the matrix is just the axial age put into the virtual world, it's kind of, I don't know if I can quite watch that movie now anyway, because it's sort of obvious now, right? But there's a character in there, Cypher, and he's one of the villains, and he wants to go back into the matrix, right? But he has one special requirement, because he actually deceives himself. He's at the restaurant inside the matrix, and he's eating a steak, and one of it's Agent Smith is there, and he says, you know, I realize that this is not a real steak, and I'm getting and I don't care. I don't care. What I figured out is I don't care. I want to go back in the matrix. But he does care. He totally cares. Because what is the one thing he demands when he gets sent back into the matrix? That he forgets that he's in the matrix. That he doesn't know that it isn't real. Because if he knew it wasn't real, it would undermine everything. Okay? So you want salience to track presence in depth. Your brain is trying to create a significance landscape. We're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to the fact that one of the things you find relevant is, right, that the process of generating significance itself. That is something you're constantly finding relevant. All right. So we've got this notion of a significance landscape, and that's what you have right here, right now. And notice, right, although there's conceptual elements to it, right, and it is not a theoretical construct. It is not primarily, you know, a belief structure. You have beliefs involved in it, but that's not primarily what it's about. It is a way in which relevance realization is self-organizing such that salience is tracking presence in depth. So that's an important aspect of it. So part of what this idea of relevance realization being what we mean by meaning, part of it is to understand how relevance realization is generating a significance landscape. Because in a significance landscape, each one of these landscapes is a way in which the brain is coupled to its environment in an increasingly complex and layered fashion. Right? So you're deeply connected and you're finding things significant in an important way. And part of what I think people mean by meaning, part of what the three orders were doing was doing exactly that, trying to get people a way of organizing their salience landscape, their affordance landscape, and their depth landscape so that salience, right, tracked presence in depth. So those are sort of the three interpenetrating landscapes of relevance realization, the phenomenology of relevance realization. So an important question to ask yourself, and try to do it as an embodied fashion, is what do you find significant? What do you find significant? And you actually find lots of things significant. Now this is a part where Jordan Peterson and I agree and disagree in certain ways, which is true about a lot of the work and the overlap between Jordan and I. So Jordan thinks that a lot of what is meant by meaning is the kind of significance that we have. When we say we're looking for a meaningful life, we're looking for this embodied significance that we're constantly generating. And when people are feeling that their lives are meaningless, they're losing that significance landscape. It's no longer, right, functioning effectively for them. I think there's truth in Jordan's argument. I think, however, there is more to meaning than just that significance, because I think that significance, this embodied day-to-day significance, right, is in deep continuity with, right, broader development and recursive complexification of significance so that we get other landscapes available to us, specifically a sacredness landscape, which I will talk about as a way in which we relate to our significance landscape. But before I do that, I want to talk more about the direct phenomenology of relevance realization. Because relevance realization, I think, basically has three dimensions, which you heard me talk about a few minutes ago. Right. Okay. So I think what ultimately grounds relevance realization, and I've already argued this, but I'll remind you to the point, and these are ideas that, based on work by Evan Thompson and Varela, and people like that, you're reading, right? And it also lines up with what I said about the work of Reid Montague. Relevance realization is dependent on an organism that is autopoietic and autonomous, that is in some sense self-governing and is making itself, taking care of itself. Only autopoietic, autonomous things seek, only they really have needs. Because the only reason to care ultimately for one piece of information over another is because you are fundamentally the kind of thing that moment to moment is taking care of itself. Because you are the kind of thing that is making itself and governing itself. That's what it is to be a living thing. I think that's how relevance comes to be in the universe. If there are no living things, there's no relevance. But even, and this is one of Evan Thompson's favorite examples, Think about even, a paramecium in some watery milieu. The paramecium will swim up a sugar gradient. Like it'll track and move in a way that gets it go towards increasing concentration of sucrose. And it will swim away from a poison. It will move in a way that consistently reduces the diffusion of poison in its environment. That's what I mean. It is organized in such a way that its behavior, right, gets it, right, to those conditions that promote and protect its very existence. Now think about, by the way, how even the paramecium then is doing something really interesting, because the paramecium is already finding a certain chemical relevant. It's standing out for it, salient. It's finding it relevant as food. There's an affordance, because food is an affordance thing. Food is something that affords consumption. Right? When you see things as edible, that's an affordance. Edibility is an affordance. Things aren't edible in and of themselves. That doesn't make any sense. Right? So, what does that mean? I think that the core relationship that gets relevance realization is that things are relevant to an organism. And I think there is a good word for that. This word. So I'm going to use that word specifically in the course to mean this, when things are relevant to you. Because look at that word. That word actually picks up on what I'm talking. What's the basis of that word, importance, which is a synonym for relevance? To import. What does import mean? To take into yourself. This is right? Stuff, again, stuff literally matters to you. You take matter and you make you out of it. It literally matters to you. And information literally, because information is physical, literally matters to your mind. Yes?
Isn't that exactly like what Plato was talking about? Wasn't he sort of right? Like, we do conform our mind to our environment, literally, structurally, functionally.
Aristotle? I think, yeah. That's okay.
I always get them all confused.
That's all right. Yes, I think so. And part of what I'm going to try and show you is exactly that. And I mentioned this, Yararo bases a lot of her work on Aristotle. That as we get into this idea of relevance realization and embodied cognition, the conformity theory can be brought back in an important way. And if that's the case, then cognitive science may provide us with a way of addressing, right. Okay, so you have how things are important to you, how things are relevant to you. Then you have co-relevance, how things are relevant to each other, how they form patterns. Now, ultimately, you want patterns, think of the paramecium, how events and pieces of the environment pattern, how they are co-relevant to each other, in order so that you can import them. So I hope that's happening right now. I'm hoping that you are finding the co-relevance between the various words I'm uttering, so that you can get a sentential meaning that you can import into your mind. So if I were to break down the syntax, which I won't try to do because it's very hard to do it on the fly, right? So if the co-relevance between the words broke down, if that pattern wasn't properly in place, you couldn't import the information into your mind. You literally couldn't consume it. Your mind is made out of patterned information. Now, because you're a mammal, because you're a social mammal, because you're a cultural mammal, and because you were born so radically premature compared to all the other mammals, a bunch of other things are also the case for you. Okay? So, because you're a socio-cultural, you need to be relevant to others. You need to matter to others. You need to, that your actions, right, make a difference to them. You need to be relevant to others. This is especially the case for human beings. So, because my children were born so, compared to other mammals, I don't mean compared to other human beings. Remember we talked about this, you're born so helpless. You're born so helpless, right? I have a strong drive to be very relevant to my sons, to do things that matter to them, that afford their flourishing, that are important to them. So, not only do we want things to be relevant to us, not only do we want things to be relevant to each other, we want to be relevant to other things. So Leo and myself, we call this transcendence in the article we wrote on wisdom. This is how things are relevant to you, which I think is fundamental to getting relevance realization going. These are things are relevant to each other in a pattern. This is how what you do is relevant to others. Now, the important thing about these patterns is the best ones are bidirectional. The best patterns are the ones that help you to import what is relevant to you and help you to generate in a transcendent fashion what is relevant to others. One of the things you are looking for, in fact, are those kinds of patterns that go both ways. Patterns that help you, right, draw in what you need and help you to, right, make yourself relevant to others. So some of your most important, I'm including myself, I'm not excluded from this, right? Some of the most important patterns we find, listen to my language, the most significant are the patterns that do that for us. They allow us to take in the information we need to nourish and flourish our mind, but they also, those same ways, those same patterns of communication or of organizing information allow us to make ourselves relevant to other people. I'm doing it right now. I'm trying to share with you patterns that have helped me take in information in a powerful way, but I'm hoping that those same patterns help make that information also relevant to you and useful and importable to you. And so these patterns are ones that I tend to find very significant, which is starting to give you a bit of an idea of how your significance landscape can be shaped into a kind of sacredness. Certain kinds of patterns are going to get a priority for you. Okay. Let's take a break here, and we'll come back and talk more about the phenomenology of the three dimensions of relevance realization. We had the three landscapes, we're going to talk about the three dimensions, and we're going to talk about the three kinds of knowing. So we've got the three landscapes, and then we've got these three dimensions. And I think, and I talked about, there's a YouTube talk that develops this argument a lot more extensively. But again, I want to try and show you how relevance realization is in cold calculation. Because I think these dimensions map onto the three kinds of love that the Greeks talked a lot about. So this is where you want to be one with something. It's a consumptive kind of relationship. And that kind of love where you want to be one with something and you want to, right, consume it or be consumed by it, right? That's eros. Now the problem for us, of course, is, again, we think of this word largely as just sexual in nature, although we still have the consumptive metaphor even in our sexual relationships. We have lots of eating metaphors, and we talk about, consummating a marriage and things like that. But eros for the Greeks isn't just sexual. It's any strong need. So you could have eros for a deity, right? Because you want to merge with the deity. Right? You want to be one with it in that sense. So that's eros. And think about how much things, right, are attract, like that they have that significance to you precisely because you'll have a strong desire to import them into your being. Plato thinks there's an eros for knowledge. Right? Which makes sense in certain ways. There's lots of information that we want to consume. Perhaps curiosity is an erotic component of our cognition. This seems to correspond a lot to philia. Philia is, right, reciprocity, getting things to work together, getting things to coordinate together. So philia sophia is the brotherly love of wisdom. People are coordinating together in order to find wisdom. And what is the love that is about making yourself relevant to others and to their flourishment? That's agape. I'm trying to show you how these different aspects of love are actually part of, again, the way in which you are experiencing the phenomenology of relevance realization. You're experiencing, right, when you experience different kinds of love, one or more of these dimensions is becoming more, right, relevant to you. So there are times, right, where you want something, as I said, what's primarily significant to you, what's grabbing your attention, the way things are presenting themselves to you and you're presenting yourself to them. And the causal patterns that you're seeking are erotic in nature. There are other times when your significance landscape is oriented towards philia. And there are other times when it is organized agapically. I would suggest to you, and some of the relationship literature seems to indicate, that what you actually want for a long-term relationship is that your significant landscape is moving through these three loves on a fairly reliable way. So that with your partner, there is erotic, and that doesn't just mean sexual, right? Although primarily it would mean that in an adult relationship. But of course you want philia, and there should be agape. So, this is again what I'm trying to show you in terms of the complexity, the complexification of relevance realization. And then again, it is not cold calculation. It is the way in which your involvement is constantly evolving. Again, this is part of what is meant by meaning. Having, right, these three dimensions accessible and live options for you is part, again, I think, of what people mean when they want a meaningful life. What I would suggest to you, and I mean, we haven't done these experiments, although there's been historical instances, if we get trapped in any one of these, we tend to find our existence in some sense impoverished. I'm not arguing for the Christian view that agape is all you need. And then the more modern Beatle version of it was all you need is love, right? If you mean it by that, no, that's simply not true, right? You need all three. And to lose any one of them would render your experience less meaningful to you. Again, what I'm trying to show you is that the word meaning is equivocal. It is pointing to many different aspects of how the relevance realization machinery couples us to the environment. It's pointing to salience and presence and depth and significance. It's pointing to these three different dimensions. But if we have relevance realization, instead of them being disconnected entities and the meaning of meaning being some ambiguous, instead what we're getting is this. Just like force equals mass times acceleration and can go in all these disparate things that we didn't think had anything to do with each other and unify them, relevance realization allows us to get a multi-apt appraisal of meaning. These different dimensions, these different landscapes, and there's going to be more. I'm trying to show you, in fact, how inadequate the word meaning really is. Do you see why we use it, though, of course, right? Because a sentence has these three aspects to it. There's the words that I can import a meaning, but I can use a pattern of words to also give you some meaning. That's why we like that metaphor, because it captures a lot of the elements. We like the linguistic metaphor precisely because it has enough of the properties of meaning as relevance realization that I'm talking about right now. All right. Yes?
I don't see the three. Like, I'm really confused. So there's so many things there. I don't know what the three dimensions are.
The three dimension is how things are relevant to you. That's this way. How things are relevant to each other, how you find patterns in things. And this is how you're relevant to others. Other things, other people. So, importance, co-relevance, and then transcendence. Okay? Now, this, right, means, as I said, we're looking for patterns that will, right, afford both erotic importance and transcendent agape. And patterns that will do both for us are going to be very significant. But those patterns also lead to talking about the three, at least three, probably more, but three basic kinds of patterns and three basic kinds of knowing that are associated with it. Okay, first of the thing, right, is there are patterns in events, courses of events. Patterns of events lead to courses of action. This is important. Courses of action. Okay, so there are patterns in events that allow you to catch a ball. There are patterns in events that allow you to swim through water. So one of the things you do is you track patterns in events that allow you to interact with the world in a successful way. This is your procedural knowing. This is knowing how to do things. This is knowing how to do things. Now, procedures are not true or false. They're appropriate or inappropriate. Right? So when you're in the water, your swimming skill is appropriate. In fact, swimming is that skill is pretty narrow. It's pretty much only appropriate there. I can't think of another context in which your swimming skill might be appropriate. Some of your other skills, of course, transfer to more than one situation. Right? This is your knowing how to do things. And our culture has only recently rediscovered, especially because of third generation cog-sci, that this is actually central to your cognition. We have become, as I've mentioned before, I've mentioned this twice and we're going to keep coming back to it, we've become a culture fixated on belief as the primary thing in terms of which we do what we do. But a lot of your behavior is actually due to your skills and your habits, to your procedural knowledge. You're knowing how to do things. But of course, you also want to know about patterns and conditions. And we've talked about this, the difference between conditions and events. You want to know conditions because what these represent are facts. Have you ever stopped to think, what's the referent of that word? We invoke it all the time. That's a fact. What's a fact? I don't mean give me an example. I don't want to do Socrates with you. What is a fact? Yes? Well, that's what you're pointing to is the things you use to point to facts. and you're doing something very important. Do you see what he used to point to a fact? He used propositions. Propositions are the cognitive states that point to facts, that give us knowledge that. Now, of course, you can state facts about events, but that's to confuse the issue. So, is it a fact that cats are mammals? Yes or no? This isn't a trick. Let's try it again. Is it a fact that cats are mammals? Right, so you're not pointing to an event, right? What is it? You're pointing to stable sets of conditions that shape what is possible. That's what you're actually picking up on. When you say that Australia is a continent, you're not stating an event, you're stating a set of conditions that limit what can happen with respect to Australia. This is what your propositional knowledge does. This is what your beliefs are for. Your beliefs are about picking up on conditions, having knowledge that this condition is the case. So you have patterns in events. You have patterns in conditions. What this basically allows you to do is you can pick up on routine. You basically can generate routines. These skillful, repeatable patterns of interaction that allow you to pick up in patterns in events. So you spend a lot of your life building up routines. Many of you have a whole set of routines that you engage in when you come into this room. You sit down and you get stuff out and you organize, right? And you do all of this stuff, right, in order to interact more effectively with this environment. Now, of course, you want also something that brings these together, right? Patterns of events and patterns of conditions. Facts and events. Coordinate them together. And not only coordinate how the facts and the events are bearing on each other, remember, patterns are how things are co-relevant. How are the facts relevant to the events? How are the events relevant to the facts? You want to draw those together. But ultimately, not only that, but how are they relevant for me? How are they relevant for my agency? That's perspectival knowing. That's knowing what it is like to take up a particular significance landscape. So, procedural knowledge, knowing how, gives you routines. Propositional knowledge, knowing that, ultimately gives you rules. And rules are statements of conditions. If you do this, then this. If you do this, then this. Right? Perspectival knowing is knowing what it is like to be X. To have a particular significance landscape in which things are salient to me in a certain way, there's an agent-arena relationship, and I'm tracking the causation and the conditions. So I know what it's like to be a teacher, which is different and incorporates knowing how to teach and knowing facts about teaching. I also know what it's like to be a teacher. Routines, rules, what does this give you? This is roles, how you take up a particular role. This is, right, knowing what it's like to be a father, knowing what it's like to be a lover, knowing what it's like to be a teacher, knowing what it's like to be a friend. Which is more than knowing how to be a friend or knowing facts about friendship. It requires both of those, but it is something beyond that. A little bit later, I'm going to talk about a fourth kind later on in the course, participatory knowing. But these are the three crucial ones that we need to talk about here. The three kinds of knowing, picking up on these three kinds of patterns. Patterns in events, patterns in conditions, and then patterns, right, between or incorporating, right, events and conditions for you. Now, our culture is obsessed with this, because what we've got is we've got psychotechnologies for organizing propositions into theory. And theory is the culminating, right, product of propositional knowing, a good theory. And I don't mean in the everyday sense where the media uses the word theory as if it means a guess. A theory, in a scientific sense, is an organized set of propositions that, right, optimize how we have tracked the facts. What would be the end result of procedural knowledge? It's not a theory, it's expertise. It's expertise, it's being an expert. So you really know how to hit a tennis ball well. Right? Now, obviously I'm talking about these analytically, and for almost all human beings, they're going to interpenetrate each other. I'm acknowledging that. But right now we're talking about them in the idealization of analysis. But perspectival knowing, what's that? What do you get if you know how to take the correct role in a situation? If you know what it's like to be a certain kind of person, to be, right? What is that? Well, what I'm going to suggest to you is that unlike either theory or expertise, the culmination of perspectival knowing is wisdom. And that's how wisdom differs from theory and expertise. Now, wisdom is going to need theory and expertise, just like perspectival knowing needs both procedural and propositional knowing. But it's something above and beyond this. Again, yes?
Excuse me, that's the events and conditions here have different meanings when you talk about Newtonian, but I think that in the mechanism for that is sort of like this
No, I'm trying to use events and conditions generally in line with the language I use to distinguish causes and constraints. In what way do you think it's differing?
I'm just like a little bit confused, because it isn't, like Newton, because that is sort of like ignoring conditions.
Yes. So one of the problems with the Newtonian worldview, for example, that many people pointed out, was that it reduced all knowing to propositions about events without actually giving us, right, the proper grounding of how we interact with events.
Okay, so,
Remember I said you can have theories about events.
yeah.
You can try and state all the conditions by which events occur. So force equals mass times acceleration is a proposition about the conditions on events, right? So there's a difference between what the facts the theory is picking up on and the kind of things it makes us pay attention to in the world. But, right, although it's oriented towards event as the fundamental sort of thing it's talking about, the fundamental way it's talking is propositional and theoretical.
Okay. So the problem of like Newtonian worldview is that even though it's talking about conditions, even though it talks about events, but they didn't talk events in terms of personal action, but talk about events as the propositional knowledge of
That's right.
how events are really significant, but not how they are realized in the environment.
That's right. I would agree with that. Is that okay? All right. Again, patterns, relevance realization. Again and again and again. So part again of what we mean by meaning are those patterns that afford procedural know-how, propositional know that, and perspectival knowing what it's like to be, that afford us the cultivation of theory, expertise, and wisdom. So think about what's going on now. I'm trying to show you, again, how this relevance realization machinery, you've got the salience landscape that maps into these dimensions that makes us look for certain kinds of patterns, and then there are, right, especially the patterns that afford both. And when we talk about patterns, there's three kinds of patterns that we are finding relevant, and that corresponds to three kinds of knowledge or knowing that matter to us. Part of the problem, again, of the cultural reduction to belief as the sole fact of our cognition is that it cuts us off from other kinds of knowing that bind us to the world in ways that matter to meaning. So if you think this is all your mind does, then of course this and this, which are fundamental ways in which you cultivate expertise and wisdom, are going to become inaccessible to you. And that means entire kinds of patterns that afford importance and transcendence are going to be removed from you. And then that's going to shape your significance landscape by impoverishing it considerably. This is all of what's going into, right, what we were trying to capture by this word, meaning. Part of the reason why we, like an academic kind of reason, why we can't address the meaning crisis is because we have not spent enough time unpacking what the term means. So I'm trying to show you that just like we had a rich history that gave us an understanding of meaning, we're now getting a rich analysis from cognitive science that gives us what we mean by meaning. Only when we get this historical, right, and structural analysis of meaning, deeply in hand, will we have what we need to address the meaning crisis. Otherwise, we are going to flail around with a term that is massively oversimplistic, massively equivocal, and therefore massively misdirecting us, even though we're trying to give voice to some very real needs and some very real concerns. All right. Filling out the multi-aptness of the phenomenology of relevance realization. There's more. So, we've got the three landscapes, the three dimensions, and the three ways of knowing. Now I want to talk about the three levels of this. The three levels. And I will not get through this today. I'm hoping that even this is somewhat empowering to you. If you can start to realize that your knowing is much more varied than you've been taught. And it has a legitimacy that is that is outside the standard way, the belief-centric notions of legitimacy. When somebody knows how to dance, that matters to us. But if we're a belief-centered culture, we can't say why. Okay, the three levels. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, to sketch out a schema, which I'm then going to spend this lecture, what remains of this lecture, which isn't much, and all of next lecture and a bit more, trying to lay out. Again, further trying to elaborate what this meaning is, and more trying to talk about a final landscape in which, right, all of this other stuff feeds back into the significance landscape, namely sacredness, and whether or not we can understand that. Another thing you should think of, which to foreshadow, as you start to understand the complexity of the meaning-making machinery, you should also understand the complexity of your vulnerability to self-deception and self-destruction because of the complexity of the meaning-making machinery. The more complex and self-organizing and dynamically recursive something is, the more it is also susceptible to self-deceptive and self-destructive patterns. A theme we've already touched upon, but which we'll come back to and will grow in importance. The very processes that make you so intelligent, such a powerful knower and meaning maker and carer about the environment, are the very processes that also make you so terrifically capable of self-deceptive, self-destructive patterns of behavior that are complex, self-organizing, virtually having a life of their own, robbing you of your agency. And I'm going to suggest to you that that is what the Buddhists mean by dukkha. They don't mean pain. They don't mean dissatisfaction. They mean patterns of self-organization that run off the very machinery of our intelligence and meaning-making that are nevertheless self-deceptive and self-destructive of our agency. And I'm going to point out to you that that meaning actually is much closer to the etymology and the original use of the word dukkha in the Buddhist literature. All right, so again, that's where we're going. Now let's draw out this schema. Let me explain to you how I'm going to use it. It's a schema, it's a diagram made to help you, it's mnemonic, to help you to remember, to help you organize. It is not the same thing as a graph or some comprehensive claim. I'm going to talk about 3 levels at which all of this machinery we have been talking about can operate. 3 levels at which all of this machinery can operate. So there's a cognitive level that is mostly unconscious, in which, of course, the key thing that is happening is that relevance is being realized. So that's basic. But we've been talking about aspects of that that are important, variations on relevance. One that we've already mentioned is resonance. Part of what we want to do is we want there to be relevance between minds. Remember when we talked about mind-site resonance? I pick up on Thomas so that I can make my behavior more relevant to him. That helps him pick up and import my mental states so that he can change his behavior so that he becomes more relevant to me, and I can import information from him. And then that cycles, and we resonate. And part of what we want are the kinds of connections between minds that are afforded by this kind of coupled relevance realization. We want resonance between minds. Most of that is happening unconsciously. So as I walked towards her and raised my voice, she started to nod her head. She wants to nod her head now because I said the word nod, which is priming, and I repeated that behavior of walking towards her and raising my voice and saying the word nod. And so she's got a pretty strong compulsion to do it right now. She'll probably nod when I turn away. Okay? Now, that machinery, she didn't sort of say, aha! He's moving, voice is going up. I'm going to resonate with him by nodding. That all happened largely unconsciously. And it was a way of her relevance realization machinery managing, right, this relationship, a particular part of her environment in a particular way, so that this could start to happen. You're doing this all the time. There's another aspect of relevance realization, reverence. Our culture has turned the word irreverence into a compliment. He's so irreverent. I don't know why that's a compliment. Reverence means that you want to be connected, coupled to things that, right, are bigger than you, more encompassing, more powerful, that afford you opportunity, that afford you promise, that afford you protection. Right? You, in fact, one of the things that people consistently say when they talk about meaning in life is they want to be connected to something bigger than themselves. And we'll talk about this later because it's obviously a metaphor. Because this person won't be happy if I chain them to a mountain. They won't go, ah. Okay, it's a metaphor. What's it a metaphor? And why do people want to be connected to something bigger than themselves? That's a rhetorical question. We'll come back to it. But did you want to give an answer?
Internalizing the sage.
Well, part of it's going to be internalizing the sage. Part of it is to, right, by being, right, coupled to something bigger than yourself, it affords your own growth. That's important. But part of it also has to do with that people want to have a transcendent relation. They want to have a relevance to something that has a value independent of their valuing of it. You want to have a connection to something that has a value other than just you valuing it. So if you can be connected to something that a lot of other people also value, that adds to your sense of meaning. We'll come back to that. That's what reverence means. Reverence means that some things are worthy of your attention because they afford the opportunity of being connected, relevance relationship with something that is, in some sense, larger than you, more encompassing than you. Or to use the language from the landscape, in some sense, transcends you.
I just want to ask a question. So, the transcendence we are talking about, so it's like pretty different from, for example, the tennis transcendence, right? Because like that kind of transcendence is like majorly upward. But this not transcendence we are talking about, like I think if I'm going to describe it sort of like real. It's not just like looking upward.
It depends. I mean, it depends. Usually the thing about looking up is when things were bigger than us, when we were kids, we looked up. And so that's where the original looking up metaphor comes. We even use looking up as a metaphor for reverence. I look up to that person. We do, so there is still an upward directedness. Now, where I do agree with you is that right now, I'm not talking about anything metaphysical the way Plotinus was in terms of orders of reality. So in that sense, I agree with you. But I do think there is, for many people, at least a metaphorical upness to reverence. So
I'm not just talking about reverence, I'm talking about the meaning of like transcendence we have been talking
right,
about.
so yes, right now transcendence, although I drew it on the board as having more of an outward, because I was trying to be neutral on this, I think when many people talk about it, especially if they talk about it in reverence language, they will start to bring in up metaphors, is what I'm saying. And then another one that's important is this, remembrance, right? We want, right, our experience to be meaningfully organized. We want, this is an actually important word, right? Look at words. Look at words. It's really important to do so. Remembrance has at its heart to be a member, to belong. Right? We want to belong to our past. That's what remembrance means. We want it to be relevant to us. We want it to connect to us. So we spend a lot of time going over our past. So when people go through certain changes and they lose, and something that was relevant to them, like a part of their past was relevant to them, and then they lose that connectedness to the past. They don't lose their memory, but they lose that connectedness. They will often experience a loss or a sense of agency. So I've been through a lot and a lot of changes, and so I sometimes will say I feel too old because I've gone through a lot of change and a lot of, because of the life I've led and the kind of relationships I've had, and I'm a lot older than most of you. And what it means is, right, the John in his 20s is becoming less and less relevant to me now. and there's nothing much I can do about that, right? And so that sense of connectedness to my past is somewhat under siege. Typically, when you've gone through several episodes of significant grief in your life, that will happen. Because generally, when you go through grief, you have to transform your significance landscape in very powerful ways, and that will disconnect you to some degree from the kind of perspectives that were central to you in your past. So you can age that way. There's an aging that none of you know what the hell I'm talking about, because you're all too young, right? You haven't done the temporal horizon flip yet. Because as you get, right now until you get to about 40, you're living from your birth, and you see it as a continuous thing. When you get past 40, you will flip, and you will start looking towards your death rather than back to your birth. And you will have gone through significant periods of grief, and you will feel less connected to the person you used to be. Okay? Well, we don't want that. We want typically to be non-fragmented. We want to have remembrance. So this is, right, these are various ways in which, so relevance is the key. These are variations on it, but they're variations, right, that lead to significant differences. And they're all interacting with each other. Of course, as your remembrance builds, it affects what you find relevant, it affects what you find reverent. What you find reverent affects what you find relevant, and what you remember, etc. All of this is happening, right? And I call this unconscious cognitive level logos. I choose that Greek word because it's really important, because it's the origin of two words that we've invoked in this course. It's the origin of the word logic, which is the normativity in our propositional knowing, but it's also the origin of the word logistical. And I've already argued, relevance realization is ultimately logistical in nature, about how you best use your resources. And the logos was how things are, in the Greek it meant how you gather things together so they belong together. It's about that fundamental relevance realization. It also was the basis of the word, like it was often translated as the equivalent for language, but it's also the basis of our word study. Like psychology is suke logos, the study, finding the important patterns. So I'm trying to capture all of that with this Greek word logos. And it was also a self-organizing kind of thing, especially in thinkers like Plotinus and Plato. We've talked about it before, the logos. Then I think there's a conscious level. This is the level at which you're making connections. This is the level at which you're experiencing them, the level we're talking a lot about. I think the primary way in which we experience relevance, not the way in which we make it happen, but the primary moments which we experience, so this corresponds to insight. That's the experiential moment where we experience relevance realization happening for us. We already talked about the kind of sight in which you experience resonance. That's mind sight. When you mind sight somebody. Remembrance, that's hindsight. It's no coincidence that we have all these insight derivative terms for these different aspects of relevance realization, and they're all terms for how we experience these different aspects of relevance realization. Now this one, I'm going to have to explain to you a little bit what it originally meant. But if you remember the Hebrew stuff, it'll make sense to you. Foresight didn't originally mean like, seeing the future in that sense. It meant like the Hebrew notion of sensing the course, sensing the bigger flow of things, being more connected. Yes? Yes. Foresight was your ability to seize opportunities. It wasn't primarily your ability to just to predict, to prophesy. The word prophecy originally didn't mean to tell the future ahead of time. That's a weird, weird derivation. The original meaning of prophecy wasn't to tell the future, it was to tell forth. It was to speak like faith. It was to tell people they were sinning or what the course is that they should be connected to, or to point out the kairos and the opportunity. That was what a prophet was. A prophet didn't say, 4,000 years from now, people will be using more hammers or some stuff like that. The point of a prophet was saying, this is what's happening right now. This is a kairos. This is the course we should follow. This is the sin. This is to miss the mark. That's foresight. That's prophecy. Being able to sense and seize the opportunity. And I think the proper type of relevance that we're talking about is reverence. A reverence for what, like a sense of being connected to something bigger that's going on. Trying to figure out how to be relevant to the course of things, especially the course of history. This is the Greek word noesis. It's where we get the Greek word for mind from. But it meant primarily noticing things. Interestingly, when Mattson talks about sizing up, he says the Greek word that most carefully corresponds to it is noesis. But it means primarily noticing in the sense of how things are becoming relevant to you. Like you notice the solution, you notice the other person's mind, you notice what was going on, right? Of course, these levels are interacting with each other. So, insight is how we experience primary relevance. Mindsight, how we experience relevance as resonance. Foresight is how we experience relevance as reverence. And hindsight is how we experience relevance as remembrance. This is all, again, part of what we mean by meaning. The cultural level. This is the level at which we share connections. The primary way, I think, in which we try to share insight is through a particular kind of metaphor, which I'll talk about more next time, a symbol, and what a symbol is. At least how we're going to use it, how it's been used primarily in sort of religious studies and cultural anthropology. It doesn't just mean where one thing stands for another. It's much more complex than that. Okay? Okay, you've got to know an obvious way in which you try and, right, trigger remembrance and trigger experiences of hindsight. And you do this weird stuff. We all do it. We collect souvenirs, which is really weird behavior. Here's a picture of me. Look, I put it on the wall. Here's a rock from this place I was at. There's a rock. We do souvenirs. We're trying to trigger remembrance and often hindsight, which doesn't mean necessarily a particular belief. It could be a particular emotional appropriation of the past. You might be trying to keep a connection to the past alive. Why do you do that? You do that precisely because of what I said can happen to you. You can lose connection from your past because your memory is not really that accurate. It wasn't set up for the accurate preservation of the past. It was set up for the intelligent prediction of the future. So you have to do things to keep that connection. Okay? How do we pick up on the kairos? How do we pick up on the turning point? How do we sense that we tell stories? mind sight. Okay? Well, we have all these various shows we do. We have ritual and ceremony and celebration. And the primary function of them is to create mind-sight resonance. You okay, so, October, and you kill the holiday bird, and everybody gets together, and you eat the same bird, and you sit at the same table. Why? Is it adding to your nutritional intake? It's actually probably a health hazard, because what most of you do is leave the university, go back to the other parasite pools that you were formerly living in, gather some parasites, come back to the university to stressful midterms, get sick, and get everybody around you sick. So Thanksgiving is actually not it's not a healthy thing to do in terms of your physiology. Why do we do it? Why do you like to eat with other people? That's a ritual. Because it's a way of creating mind-sight resonance. It's a way of getting on the same experiential page. If you're eating, I can get some sense of your perspectival knowing. And even though I don't have to talk about it, but the fact is that because we're both sharing it, we're having shared attention, shared experiences, it's easier for us to get into mind-sight resonance. Sharing food is a great way to create resonance between people, which is, of course, why we also eat food, usually with somebody, when we want to have sex with them. It's not like to get, well, I guess some of it's metabolic preparation, but generally the main point of it, right, is to create mind-sight resonance. If you think that your life does not have ritual in it, you're sadly mistaken. Your life is filled with ritual. And many of you might find that even offensive for me to say. But it is. You do lots of things for the sole purpose of trying to engender and create mind-sight resonance with other human beings. If you go to sporting events, you're engaged in a ritual. Because this is the thing about sporting events. Nothing is happening historically. Bunch of people run around, objects flung through air, people fall and get up. What's the point? The point is so the people on the field have tremendous mind-sight resonance with each other, and the people in the crowd have tremendous mind-sight resonance with each other, and the team and the audience also have mind-sight resonance with each other. The point is exactly that. It's a weird ritual, and we will spend time and money and energy to do it. We will go crazy. Canada's real religion is hockey. So symbols trigger experiences of insight that can alter what we find relevant. Stories can trigger experiences of foresight, which can alter what we find reverent. Souvenirs can trigger hindsight, which can alter what we remember, what we find remembrant, if I can coin a term. And various shows, rituals, and ceremonies trigger mindsight, which can alter what we find resonant. Now, the point of all this is these are all interacting with each other because, as I've tried to show you, this is a dynamically self-organizing process. These are, and these various levels. Here's the word for this level, this Greek word, mythos. That's where we get the word myth from. But a myth, has come in our language, again because of our belief-centric culture, to mean an untrue story that is widely believed. That's not what a myth is. Myths aren't false stories about the past. They're not false stories about the past. Myths are stories and symbols and souvenirs and shows that are about perennial and pervasive patterns that are ongoing all the time. That's what mythos is. That's why I'm not going to use the English word myth, because it has a degenerative meaning that I'm rejecting. This is mythos. Mythos is the cultural. And what I'll do next class is go over each one of these and do the cognitive science in more detail. Because we've talked a lot about this when I talked about relevance realization. We've talked a lot about this already in some of the psychology. This is what I'm going to talk a lot more about. But I need a word for all three of these levels working and interacting together. And it's the word I've already pointed out to you. This is religio. This, right? Now please gather it all together. You have the three landscapes, the three dimensions, the three ways of knowing going into each one of these levels. You have these three levels interacting in this fashion: logos, noesis, and mythos. That is religio. And religio, right, is that fundamental, right, is how that fundamental framing is expressed through the landscapes, the dimensions, the knowings, and the levels. Yes?
What is like primary relevance?
Pardon me?
What is primary relevance inside single level?
What is it symbolized by?
No, I mean, what is like primary relevance? We said that like reverence is like connected to something bigger, relevance is like relevance between mind,
Right.
remembering past. So what is relevance?
I think relevance is what I sort of argued last time. No, do you mean experientially, or I'm not quite clear on what you mean. I mean, relevance is the ability to zero in on the information you need to solve your problems. It's to avoid combinatorial explosion. It's to ultimately get that machinery of salience and presence and depth going for you. Is that what you were asking? Great. Okay. Now, I think there's a fundamental difference between religio and credo. I think religion combines both. And that's why simply criticizing religion is a mistake, because it's overly simplistic. So this is all of this machinery of making, sharing, making, experiencing or sensing, sharing connections, all of that feeding back into the dimensions, the ways of knowing, the landscape. That's religio. Credo is, right, I believe. The statement of propositions that are to be asserted. We have come to think, because of the dominance of a Christian interpretation of the other Abrahamic religions, that religion is all about assertion of beliefs. Okay? That is a very ethnocentric and anachronistic way of understanding the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is not primarily organizing its experience of religio that fashion. What is credo? How could we understand it functionally? I think what credo is the attempt to try and clarify the signals for religio. So a problem we face in our relevance realization is the information we want that's relevant to us, the signal, is often overlapping or ambiguously mixed up with information we don't want, which is called noise. This is called signal detection theory. So there's a noise in the bush. You're a gazelle. Is it the leopard you want to avoid, or is it the wind that's irrelevant to you? That's what a signal is, by the way. It's information that's relevant to you. The problem is you can't tell. So you have to do something. You have to do what's called set a criterion. Some people think this is one of the functions of consciousness, by the way. What you have to do is make a decision, and the decision is almost always not a conscious decision, right, initially, about what in here you're going to count as signal and what you're going to count as noise. And it depends upon, right, how you're coupled to your environment, what the risks are in your environment. So for example, if you're a gazelle and there's a noise in the bush, what are you going to do most of the time? You're going to run, because the two types of mistake are not the same. If I miss a leopard that's there, I'm potentially dead, and dead is really bad. If I think there's a leopard there when there isn't, and I run around, all that happens is the other gazelles laugh at me. Okay? But there are other situations where you go exactly the reverse. I have to face this every time I'm marking you, because many of you will write stuff that's clearly signal, clearly relevant to the course and to the theory, and then unfortunately there'll be stuff that's clearly, no, that's not relevant, sorry. You missed it. But a lot of you will do this. You'll say stuff that it's like, I can't tell if it's signal or noise. So what's the risk? Should I count it mostly as signal and give this kind of feedback? Or should I count it mostly as noise and give this kind of feedback? And there's no absolute rule for doing this. I have to make a judgment based on what's going on in your answer, what you're doing in your other answers, how I've come to know you in the class, how I've come to know you across courses, all of that stuff. What I'm trying to say is, this is setting the criterion is a very difficult thing to do. So what we typically do is we look for prototypical examples of how to set the criterion. We look for prototypes. We'll look for prototypical events and prototypical conditions. So we'll try to give, right, prototypical rules, prototypical routines. We try to capture, right, we try to create a way of setting the criterion. Part of the function, I would argue, the central function of Credo is to do exactly that. It's to give us paradigmatic ways of setting the criterion. It's an attempt to say, this is real religio, this isn't. This is real religio, this isn't. This is real religio, this isn't. All cultures do that. Cultures do that. All religions do that in some sense, but we've created this special thing in which we've tried to give something like a theory that will say what should always be, or how the criterion should always be set, because we have some account of what things are permanently and always going to be relevant. Right? Orthodoxa, the right, unchangeable beliefs. I think Credo is unavoidable because there's always going to be signal detection issues. Is that person having an insight, or are they going crazy? Was that a mystical experience, or were they just tripping out? Right? Am I really, really in touch with others, or am I just a jerk? There's always going to be signal detection issues. So a lot of people say, well, I want the experience. So part of what people mean by spirituality is, I want the experiences, but I don't want the belief structure. You're fooling yourself. If you think you can do religio without having some kind of credo, you're mistaken. What you probably have is an implicit, unconscious credo, because you have to make all kinds of decisions about ambiguous signals, whether they count as religio or not. What we can criticize is a couple things about credo, right? We can criticize credos that claim to give us the final answer, and I'm going to use this term deliberately, and I mean it to be slightly offensive. That's deliberate. When we get accounts of the final solution to relevance. Right? That we can criticize because there is no final answer, no completed version, because relevance isn't a stable thing, it is an evolving relation. Whenever we try and reify relevance into a static thing that is permanent and unchanging, I think we are going against the fundamental nature. So whenever Credo tries to do that, I think we have the basis for a legitimate criticism of it. Whenever Credo tries to make it self-central and say the beliefs are what matter most, then we also have a basis for criticizing it. Because the belief structure, right, is only one kind of knowing, and it is not only that, it is propositional knowing for the task of criterion setting. Credo should always be in the service of religio, not the other way around. And one of the things I think Buddhism offers is that, although it historically has made errors along what I've just said, it is officially, whatever that means, set up to not claim that there is any reified substance to relevance, some ultimate thing of relevance. And it has always, often had revolutions, Zen is a prototypical example, where Credo is always put back in service of religio. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, because the Credo has started to strangle the religio. That's it for today.